Good evening. I'm Jennifer Lezak, coordinator of the One Book, One Chicago program. Before we begin tonight's event, a few announcements. First, please silence your cell phones during the program. Books are available for sale in the lobby, courtesy of the bookseller in Lincoln Square. Signed book plates will be available at the conclusion of tonight's event, and we will distribute those as you exit. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook, so we invite our virtual viewers to leave your questions in the chat for the Q&A portion of our evening. This event will also be available to view on demand after the program, so please share it with a friend who couldn't attend tonight. Now please welcome Chicago Public Library Commissioner Chris Brown.
Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see such a packed house. Again, I'm Library Commissioner Chris Brown, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, I want to welcome you to our 2022 One Book, One Chicago signature event with Pulitzer Prize winner Art Spiegelman, author of this year's book selection, Mouse. This year's One Book, One Chicago theme, Freedom to Read, comes at a time of increased book challenges and book bans across our country. The American Library Association reported more than 1,500 attempted bans of individual book titles in 2021 alone. And of course, in Chicago, one of the most diverse cities in the world, we celebrate our diversity and our underrepresented voices. Of course, it's hard to have a citywide read without the city all there together with us. And at Chicago Public Library, the freedom to read is literally written into our mission. And with the support of Mayor Lightfoot, we're deepening our commitment to our freedom to read, establishing our 81 library locations as book sanctuaries, as safe spaces for diverse voices, and making sure that frequently challenged books are always available to our city. Through our Book Sanctuary Initiative, we have over 1,200 declarations of support representing all 50 states across our country and are providing focused programming like this evening. Selecting Art Spiegelman's Mouse, one of the most frequently challenged books, allows us to deepen our commitment to our library's mission and to show solidarity with our diverse author and reader communities. It also lets us celebrate and explore this Pulitzer Prize-winning, groundbreaking graphic novel that not only is a story of triumph over anti-Semitism and hate, but is also a very real human story of trauma, family, survival, and resilience. Tonight's One Book, One Chicago event was made possible thanks to the generous support of the Chicago Public Library Foundation, Bank of America, United Airlines, and the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. I want to thank Mayor Lightfoot, our First Lady, Amy Eshelman, who herself helped establish and create our One Book, One Chicago program, and all of our funders. And of course, I want to thank our library staff for making tonight's event possible. Thank you all for supporting this most democratic of freedoms, our freedom to read. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Priya Sadarangani from Bank of America to the library stage.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Priya Sadarangani, and I am the Chicago Market Executive at Bank of America, and I am so grateful for this opportunity to speak with you all tonight. I'm going to take you back 30 years to my 8th grade English classroom. That class and my teacher, Ms. Chandok, had a lasting impact on my life. I can still place myself in the basement level classroom of our middle school in Brooklyn. I sat at sort of the back left-hand corner of our U-shaped formation of desks. And so many years later, I can somehow still tap into some of the emotions that I felt during our class discussions. How is that possible? I credit the lasting impact of that experience with Ms. Chandok in large part to the blockbuster list of novels that we read, that she curated for our class. We read To Kill a Mockingbird, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, The Great Gatsby, Catcher in the Rye, amongst others. The culmination of our year was writing a series of vignettes inspired by The House on Mango Street. I still have my list of my book of vignettes to this day. Those books and that writing project solidified my lifelong love of reading and writing, which I'm sure many of you would agree is the greatest gift of all. Why do I mention this? Well, it's disheartening and it's terrifying that the list of books I mentioned by such esteemed authors, true classics, which have prompted countless debates and discussions throughout our country, throughout our world, have at some point been banned or censored somewhere or in some way. In the early 90s, when Ms. Chandok assigned them, several of them were amongst the most banned titles in the country. It's scary to think that at any point in time, kids, adults, teachers in this country could be denied access to many life-changing, awe-inspiring books. But the reality is that while the list of scrutinized books and scrutinized topics continues to evolve over time, the intensity of the censorship battles is only escalating. Even here in Illinois, even just this past week. For this reason, now more than ever, I'm grateful to live in a city that our mayor has declared a book sanctuary. Now more than ever, I am grateful that my family and our communities have access to the Chicago Public Library's 81 branches, where we're all free to engage with any and all books. And now more than ever, I am proud to be here tonight to represent Bank of America's sponsorship of One Book, One Chicago. We salute the Chicago Public Library for their sage and timely choice of freedom to read as this year's One Book, One Chicago theme, and furthermore, for choosing Art Spiegelman's groundbreaking, thought-provoking, chilling, enlightening masterpiece, Mouse, as this year's One Book, One Chicago selection. After reading Mouse for the first time last week, I felt like I was back in Miss Chandok's 8th grade English class, questioning, ruminating, experiencing the wave of emotions that only a great book can really provide. Bank of America's Chicago team delights in the opportunity to help provide access to Mouse for an estimated 35,000 Chicagoans. And we're energized by all of the surrounding book clubs, workshops, screenings, and other events which will deepen our community's engagement with Mouse. And, even more importantly, remind us all of our fundamental freedom to read. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Bank of America. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest this evening. Art Spiegelman is one of the world's most admired and beloved comic artists, best known for his Pulitzer Prize-winning Holocaust narrative, Mouse, the 2022 One Book, One Chicago selection. Born in Stockholm in 1948, Spiegelman began studying cartooning in high school and drawing professionally at age 16. He studied art and philosophy at Harper College before joining the underground comics movement of the 1960s. Spiegelman taught history and the aesthetics of comics at the School of Visual Arts in New York from 1979 to 86, and in 80, he founded Raw, the acclaimed avant-garde comics magazine, with his wife, Françoise Mouly. Honors Spiegelman has received include induction into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame and the Art Directors Club Hall of Fame. In 2005, he was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. He was made an Officer des Ordres des Arts, Letters in 2007, and in 2011, he was awarded the Grand Prix at the Angoulême International Comics Festival. In 2015, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2018, he became the first comic artist to receive the Edward McDowell Medal. His art has been exhibited at museums throughout the world, including the Pompidou Center in Paris, the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Jewish Museum in New York City, and the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. It's almost impossible to fully state the impact that Spiegelman has had on the literary, comics, and art world. Most recently this month, a new book titled Mouse Now, edited by Hilary Shute, brings together essays from 21 leading critics, authors, and academics on the radical achievement and innovation of mouse. We are so pleased to have Art here with us tonight in person to celebrate the 2022 One Book, One Chicago season. This evening, Art will be in conversation with another influential figure in the world of comics and graphic art, and someone he knows quite well, his wife, Françoise Mouly. Mouly has been the art editor of The New Yorker since 1993, where she has overseen more than 1,400 covers. In 1978, she co-founded with Spiegelman the groundbreaking comics anthology Raw. She has co-edited the New York Times bestselling Little Lit series and the Toon Treasury of classic children's comics. Mouly is the publisher, designer, and editorial director of Toon Books, which she launched in 2008, and Toon Graphics, launched in 2014. In 2017, she collaborated with not just Spiegelman to publish Resist, a collection of comics and graphics primarily by women. Mouly is the editor of Best American Comics 2012, and in 2012 she released Blown Covers, about the creative process behind New Yorker covers, and Postcards from the New Yorker, 100 Postcards from 10 Decades. Jeet Heer's In Love with Art, the first biography of Ms. Mouly, appeared in 2013. She has curated exhibits internationally and lectured extensively on the art of New Yorker covers. She has received numerous awards, including the Chevalier of the Order of the Arts and Letters by the French Ministry of Culture and Communication, the Ordre National de la Légion d'Honneur, an honorary doctorate in fine arts from Pratt Institute, and in 2021, Mouly was inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. Please join me in welcoming Art Spiegelman and Françoise Mouly to the CPL stage.
Well, thank you so much. This is both the most natural and the most exotic of things, to be on a stage with a microphone and being able to not so much interview but have a conversation with my husband, somebody that I love and respect and have listened to for so many years, but I'm hoping that the presence of an audience, so thank you for being here, will get him to say things that I'd be curious to hear.
I love you, honey.
Thank you. You can see we prepared this extensively. I would like, I love the theme, freedom to read, because it is what brought us together many, many, many years ago. And I'd love to start by asking you to talk about your experiences of libraries, which is something I didn't know about growing up in France, but were important for you.
Yeah, it saved me. You see, I have only one good eye. This meant that baseball was almost impossible for me, and I was always somewhere in the outfield, missing anything that was thrown my way.
You want to hold your mic?
Missing anything that was thrown my way, and I had to escape before the teams were chosen at the end of school day, before the back lot games would start. And I just flee to the library as fast as I could, because I knew I could get there within 5 minutes and just hang there and not have to be in this otherwise humiliating position, because at the time, to be bad at baseball was to be, in the hierarchy that existed at the time, lower than a girl. And the result was just that I exhausted all of the books in the children's section of my Rego Park Queens library, but I was such a fixture there that they let me have carte blanche and run of it. So I think I was reading Kafka stories at the age of 12 and just thought he would have been great writing The Twilight Zone if they would let him. And just went on from there. And there's a moment there where I even wanted to be a librarian. So might have been a better idea than this kind of strange roller coaster ride I've been on. But ultimately, it did allow me to build my own library. So I have a giant one in the house and can supplement it with the public library. And I'm grateful to be here specifically because, man, libraries are under such threat. I never believed that wanting to become a librarian would be like wanting to join the Marines or something, you know, you'd have to just defend yourself through thick and thin just to present and make books available. So it's where I really learned how to love books and read them all the time, and it more or less continues, although I gotta say my book reading slowed down somewhere between the election of Donald Trump and COVID. Like, I can only read short stories of Kafka now.
And I'd like to go back to, again, the time when I met you. My English was faltering. I mean, it was pretty non-existent. And I had been introduced to a comic strip that you had done about your mother's suicide. Mm-hmm. And this is something that later on got reproduced in Mouse. It's Prisoner on Hell Planet. But I remember being absolutely astonished in the reading of this that you were dealing with something that was so intimate. In the comic strips, there was a disconnect there, and you were addressing your mother and expressing some feelings that felt very like not what one would expect. Can you talk about what happened to you that made you want to deal with such a personal, traumatic event in your life in the form of a comic?
I didn't know any better. It seemed to me that comics didn't have to be reduced simply to stories of Jews who came from Krypton and whatever, from the shtetl to the big earth, or the things that just delivered a joke a day. And when I was in high school, which was a trade school, pretty much, that I could take academic courses in, I was hoping to become a cartoonist of some kind. They had comics courses, the only school in New York that taught such things. And we had an assignment to draw a comic strip, a week of comic strips, and a former graduate who was an editor of one of the syndicates said, "This is great, I'm going to groom you for syndication, kid." So I'm 17 years old and was asked to go to the top of the heap. And I did 5 for the class assignment. He said, "Just do 2 weeks more, and then I think we can put this over." And I did about 4 days more and started thinking about what the rest of my life would be, like making variations on jokes with the same few characters.
But at the time, being a syndicated cartoonist was the top of the heap.
It was absolutely the top of the heap.
It was being like Steven Spielberg. It was being like...
Yeah, and ultimately, like, you know, for later years of his life, Charles Schulz was always on the Forbes top 100 richest people on the planet list. That's what one would aspire to. And what was great was not being able to do the rest of the 2 weeks and go back there, because it was great. Now I know what I don't want to do, but I still want to be a cartoonist. And fortunately for me, underground comics were starting to happen. I went down to the East Village Other and figured, God, the stuff they have here really sucks. So even I could get in. So I went and talked to the editor, and the editor said, "This is good, but we want stuff with more sex and drugs in it." And I didn't know anything about sex or drugs when I was 17 years old. So I had to go to college, learn about sex and drugs, and a year later came back and was doing stuff for the East Village Other. By then, Robert Crumb, who's a very important comics artist who's currently canceled, but is nevertheless one of the great draftsmen of the 20th century and a great reinventor of what comics could be, began to do comics without punchlines. And other people gathered around with similar impulses. Like, after I didn't want to do a comic strip for a newspaper, I started making comics that were just stranger and stranger. I did an ongoing thing for my college paper called A Very Strange Comic Strip. So soon I met a guy named Justin Green, who's an underground comics artist also, who did a book called Binky Brown, and it was a revelation. He was the first person to really make an intimate, autobiographical, genuinely creepy revealing of what's inside his head, dealing with his obsessive-compulsive disorders and his rebellion against and guilt because of the Catholic Church he was brought up in. it was a revelation to me, to Robert Crumb, and to many other cartoonists, and he just died a few months ago, and he was given decent obituaries, but he's not sung as full-throatedly as he deserves. It just opened up possibilities for me, and, well, at some point, it just became obvious to me and a few other cartoonists that that's where it belongs. There's nothing more personal than a comic strip. Like, basically, all you're doing is you're putting words and pictures together. So I remember, these answers are long, so you're allowed to tell me shut up even on stage.
No, I'm actually hoping that you will unpack exactly as you are, so
okay.
thank you.
Well, the thing was that there was a book that came out, I guess in the 90s maybe, called The Gutenberg Elegies. Maybe some of you know it. It's about how the internet, the world of electronics was destroying people's attention span, and we were losing the most precious thing we had, which is literary fiction, which was the best machine ever invented for seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. And he was right, but even while I was reading, I said, yeah, that's true, but comics even more so, because you're not just getting the words, you're getting words and pictures. So it's as if every novel written was written by hand instead of set in type, so you'd get what graphologists can find out from a handwriting, for example. And that's part of what the picture making is, or icon making. Because as I learned, actually, partially from Françoise, babies, she reads the science magazines, I read the comics, so if we're panning across the sitcom, it's like, okay, there's the idiot on the left. But she was telling me about how they found out that babies can recognize their mother smiling only after they've learned to read a smiley face. So we're hardwired to understand that graphic language of what happens from, it's like we think in emoticons and in brief bursts of language, which defines how comics are put together. When I was dealing with my father's stories, I had to still capture his voice, but reduce everything down to a version of his speech that still sounded like him talking to me, but I couldn't do it verbatim, obviously, because then there'd be like a 4-foot-high speech balloon and a 2-inch-high mouse, and that would be one panel, and move on from there. So it seemed very natural to move into the issues that I had with Prisoner on the Hell Planet, which catalyzed all this. The thing was that I kind of suppressed what had happened. It was just too traumatic for me. And if somebody asked, I could say my mother committed suicide, but it was, talk about not being in touch with your feelings. I had a special pocket to pull that sentence out. Oh yeah, my mom's dead, she killed herself. And then at some point in the midst of a household spat with my then girlfriend, I was furious at her for nothing, and then realized, I'm not mad at her, I'm mad at mom, says I, like finally retrieving some of the Freud I'd read in that same library where I found Kafka. And it all came flooding back. I stopped working on a rather insignificant comic at that time and just wanted to put it all down on paper, and that's what developed into that 4 pages that made me fortunate enough to get you confused enough to give me a call.
And if you can talk a little more about that process, like was that the first time after seeing Justin's works that you were actually dealing with something that was so emotionally powerful that you were putting it in little boxes?
Not exactly. I mean, I did do a comic strip right in the wake of the event while I was still completely disoriented that ran in the East Village Other. It was just a kind of poem. It's going to be flying around these things in the background if you lose interest in my long sentences. But it was the first time that I had something that dealt with the despair in a slightly abstracted way. And I did do the comic strip version, the short version of Mouse, a 3-page comic for an underground comic called Funny Aminals, edited by Justin Green. Everything else was supposed to be about animal rights, but none of the cartoonists followed the directive in this anthology comic. It was just use anthropomorphic characters like Donald Duck. And after fishing around for a while, I realized that the stories my father had told me were still not part of the general currency. This was 71, 72, and it just wasn't part of the conversation. Now there's a Best Holocaust Movie of the Year award at the Oscars, I think, but at the time it just wasn't part of the public discourse. And I realized it was a story that deserved telling, and I started doing it and realized I was stuck in the middle because as some of you may have heard, I didn't get along that well with my father. But I came through the city and visited him, and I had this half-finished 3-page comic. He was playing cards with a bunch of his survivor friends, the people who had also gone through that, a similar parallel past, and that he was comfortable with. I showed him what I was working on, and I showed it to the other survivors at the card table as well, and it just started another conversation with them. Yeah, when you were there, I was in another camp, Buchenwald, and blah, 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 blah. And then one of my cousins that I really liked said, oh, yeah, I was in the Gulag in Russia, and everybody just said, you just had it soft, you know. So that was going on, and then my father's looking at the strip, half finished, and I just told a part that you may, if you've read the book, where some informer in the ghetto was sitting in the house that was supposed to be abandoned and heard stirrings up in a hidden attic above the chandelier. And so he knew that there were Jews hiding there. He was a Jew himself. And although some of the rest of the family that was in that attic wanted to kill him, they just didn't have the training to be killers. In fact, in the audience, my cousin is here. His father was one of the ones saying, we've got to kill this man. But none of them could bell the cat, let's say. And as a result, the next day they were taken away out of that bunker. And then my father, that's about where I was in the story, he said, you know that guy who turned us in? Turns out I buried him. I said, what? And he said, like, yeah, the Germans had no loyalty to him just because he was an informer, and they'd killed him. So he was on the detail that had to bury this man. And then I realized, man, there's a lot of stories I don't know. And he wasn't that forthcoming telling me about it. So I had to stay around and get more of his stories when he was willing to tell me them.
Yes, I wanted to go back to you growing up with, in your house with your parents. How come you so adamantly defied their hopes for you? Like, they weren't hoping that you would become a cartoonist. That wasn't at all there.
No, and they weren't interested in me being a hippie living on a commune either. Like, but why? I don't know. I think I'm just in some ways deficient. I didn't realize when I was breaking various taboos, making what became Mao's, I didn't understand that one of the taboos was not being thoroughly respectful, honoring one's father and mother, because all the other survivors, kids that I knew in that extended circle, were just, I don't want to be a doctor, but I'll become one because my parents want me to, and I don't want to, it's so amazing that they're still alive, I've got to do what they would want. And I just never had that. I was just rebellious. And I don't fully, even though I've been in and out of therapy at various times in my life, I still don't know fully why I was in that deep a resistance to doing it. But back in the day, they talked about a generation gap, and between my father and me was a generation chasm. I just couldn't bridge it. And so I was just, I think one of the reasons I really started making comics was it was a language he couldn't understand. You know, he understood about 4 other languages, but not comics.
But speaking of languages, there were cultural differences in your family between your father and your mother.
Yeah.
They didn't quite come from the same, even though geographically they grew up not far from each other, culturally and in terms of education and class. Can you talk a little bit about
the difference?
The difference and the feelings that you experience in terms of being your father's son and being your mother's son.
Sure. Well, about the family background, on one branch of the family tree, my father's was in a tiny shtetl-like village, was his father, who was not a rabbi, but was Orthodox Jewish, as Andrew, my cousin's father, said of Vladek's father, when I asked him about stuff. He said, well, he was just a bearded kind of a thing. You know? And my mother's family, including Lalek, were much more secular. They were also far wealthier and much more educated. than my father's family. My father was a good hustler in terms of making a living, but the mother's side of the family, her father started a hosiery mill and was very well off. And my mother knew various other languages, and in fact, when they met, my father had been studying English on his own because he wanted to go to America, where the streets, as you all know, are paved with gold. And the result was he knew some English. She had been studying English in school as well as French and was a very good student. But he had heard her at some point talking English to her friend, and he knew what she was saying, and that made a connection between them that allowed them to get together. The thing that the people I met had been kind of whacked up by this thing called World War II, and both of them had incredible, what we would now blithely say is post-traumatic stress disorders. But the result was my father had much more rigid sense of what it meant to survive and to keep your eye out for the main chance, and worked really hard, was very honest, but had no interest in books, in art, or anything like that. My mother, from the cultured background I was trying to sketch out for a minute, was very encouraging of me in terms of drawing, and even comics. And when I read books in school she didn't know, she would then read the novels as well, and we'd have our private two-person book club in the afternoons. And this went great until I hit puberty hard. At that point, I was beginning to be resistant to staying under her wing. By the time I went to this high school in Manhattan, which was a subway ride from Queens, I felt like I was in another world. And as soon as I dated my first shiksa, as they called them, there were tensions in the household that never fully resolved there. And with my father, the tensions remained all our lives together.
I'm wondering if you, when I first met you, like you were giving a lecture about comics and you were a passionate advocate of comics, and you called your talk idiosyncratic and historical. Can you talk about your the fact that you were an autodidact, but that you actually were so interested in the history of this field that was not chartered at the time?
Okay. Yeah, Françoise was leaving out that she helped me make the slides for this talk. It was just, but I just was exposed to a book in 1963 called Comic Art in America. It was just a kind of history of what happened from sometime in the 19th century into the then present of 1963. And it only had a few tantalizing examples of a few panels of Little Nemo, a few panels of Crazy Cat, Mutt and Jeff, and so on and so on. And to me, it was like having a window into an, you know how we have metaverses? It was a metaverse away. It was, these don't look anything like the comics that are in the papers that I'm getting by collecting the various Sunday sections off the stoops of our neighbors and stealing them. And wanted to know more about what they had been, and this book was just a clue. And then I'm back in the library again, you know, like I was, all right, one of the libraries that I could get to was the Queens Library that still had, before microfilm, they actually had bound volumes, and I would just go to that library on my bike and just sit in the stacks and read old comics from the 1930s and 40s that were just in these bound books, and drank it all in. So the people I admired were not the people who drew whatever, Doctor Strange or Fantastic Four and like that, but man, the guy who drew Barney Google could really handle a pen, you know? And it just deepened as an interest, because certainly the newspaper strips were really made for a family, and that included adults. So it already had a different tenor to it than the comics I would have otherwise been exposed to. At some point I was lucky enough to find a stack of comics from the early 50s on the garbage can. You know the proverbial mothers who threw out comic books? One of them lived on our block. And so a giant stack of EC horror comics and the best comic books of that pre-Comics Code, if you know what that is, era, an era that led to comic book burnings because comics caused juvenile delinquency. Maybe that's where my rebelliousness came from, because I found a stack of comics that were definitely creating a generation of juvenile delinquents. And those things were a revelation. It included Mad when it was a comic book in that pre-dawn era.
Let's talk a little bit. I would like you to mention, like, obviously you had trouble with your father as a figure of authority, and you did find spiritual mentorship in Woody Gelman and also in Harvey Kurtzman. Can you talk about
Mentors?
Yeah,
Okay.
how that shaped you?
Sure. Let's see. Harvey Kurtzman was, for the most part, he was the creator of Mad Comics and of a comic book called Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat, which were coming out during the Korean War. And they weren't like the John Wayne kind of comic books of, you know, here's one for my Aunt Tilly throwing a grenade into a nest of Koreans. He was doing very historically based, very emotional short stories about how, you know, this isn't Sergeant Rock and the Easy Company. This is a bunch of scared kids who are in this situation that's unlivable, literally. So I just was learning from looking at Harvey Kurtzman's work how he parsed a page. You know, movies had a D.W. Griffith who gave us almost fully the grammar of film, what a close-up is, what crosscuts are, what that language of telling a story is. Comics was much more incremental, and Harvey Kurtzman had distilled it into a very learnable, rational kind of panel breakdown on the page, thinking of a page a certain way. And I just sifted it from reading all the stories, and it became a useful template for all of my work after that. But eventually, I met him, we became friends, and I was very honored to be the friend of a genius. Woody Gelman was a guy who was the creative director of Topps Bubblegum, Bazooka. And at the age of 15 or 16, in my appetite to just have more and know more about this stuff, Topps Bubblegum used to have little cartoons on the back of baseball cards saying whatever, like Willie Mays hit 200 home runs in 30 days or whatever, and a little spot cartoon on the back. And he did some humor cards like Funny Valentines, your teeth are like stars, you turn it over, they come out at night, with really great drawings. And they were drawn by Jack Davis, who was one of the holy trinity of the original Mad Comics artists, who I, at that time, couldn't have admired an artist more. So I figured I'll call a bubblegum company, because anybody else publishing, they would know what they have, but there's nothing lower than a bubblegum company. So I called up and magically got put through to the creative development department where this man, Woody Gelman, was, and I was doing a little, very terrible fanzine at the time, printed in purple ink, called Blasé, because I thought that was a more sophisticated title than Mad when I was 14. And I told him I was doing this magazine, and he said, well, why don't you come out to lunch with me at Topps Bubblegum, and I'll swap you your magazine for a few Jack Davis originals. I was glad to do that one, and I went out to the depths of Brooklyn, a neighborhood which was then described in the history of Topps Bazooka Bubblegum as a neighborhood so dangerous that even Joey Gallo wouldn't go out there at night. So it was an amazing, surreal place to be out in Brooklyn that had a Unita doll factory right on top of the bubblegum cobblestone streets leading to this factory building that was originally for World War I munitions. And it was surreal. You'd walk past all these broken doll arms and heads that you'd be walking on that had been transported out the day before, and all of these stolen cars, the wreckage of which was there. Went up to this Topps Bubblegum company, met a really wonderful avuncular man who had a passion for old printed ephemera and especially for comics. He had been not especially great comics artist, but had worked in comic books as well. He'd made the trade. I still have those few Jack Davis originals somewhere in my rubble of my house. And we had a great time because he'd never met a kid my age who knew almost as much about the old comics as he did. So we just got along well. Turns out as soon as I turned 18, I got a letter saying, would you like to work for a bubblegum company? He had put a little post-it on, well, they didn't have post-its, a little taped piece of paper over my magazine, put it in his files, and had a note to call me when I turned 18. And I really would have loved to, but because of the same reason I had to go to college to learn about sex and drugs, I had to go to college to avoid the draft. So I couldn't just join up with the best job I could ever have, but I did get a summer job with him, and it went from there. We worked really well together. I had a freelance job for as long as I wanted it, and I worked there for about, 20 some odd years, mostly as a freelancer, but when I wanted to be in the office, I could always be there. And it was in that context that I was the creator of something that, if there's any older people here, they might remember something called Wacky Packs, which was feeding my mad lessons back. So it would be like Crust toothpaste instead of Crest, or whatever, Toad detergent for cleaning your pet frogs, or Kami cleanser with a very anti-Bolshevik Uncle Sam on it, and so on. And then a generation later, with a student of mine, when I was teaching comics history and aesthetics at the School of Visual Arts, I invited him to be my assistant, and while I was there with him, we started something called Garbage Pail Kids, which is still very much with us. And at the time was one of my great experiences among many of being banned. Because Garbage Pail Kids made, I think it was the uncle of Manchin, the senator who's kind of a Republican in Democrats' clothing or something. Well, a relative of his, I think uncle, was higher up in the governmental hierarchy of Virginia, and he was outraged by Garbage Pail Kids and was sputtering about them on the media, and wanted them banned in Virginia, and said, the kids who read this, it's like reading Mad. They don't learn any respect for their elders, they don't understand values, and these just cannot be allowed. And it put Garbage Pail Kids on the map from 1984 or 5 to now. So Woody was just an incredibly important man to me. His basement was filled with a giant library and archive of Sunday newspaper pages, original art, old advertising supplements, and it was at a time when nobody had that stuff. It was only seen as a fire hazard. But he had an amazing array of things. I would go out to his house in Long Island with him, stay overnight, but be allowed to stay up in his basement and read and look at whatever I wanted. And he was very important in giving me a sense of direction, and even at placating my father, because from this maybe you could make a living.
So speaking of being banned, one of the recent instances is McMinn County in Tennessee. And I remember, the evenings when we heard about this, and you had to address it because you were asked by journalists to respond. But I remember, can you talk about the emotions that it felt, not about being banned per se, but about the pretext that they were using for banning your book?
Sure. So I found out about it 20 minutes after the minutes for the meeting had been released and published, which turned out to have been 2 or 3 weeks after they had already banned Mao's, but I just made it public, and something called the Tennessee Holler, a kind of left-wing news disseminator in Tennessee, had the minutes and then gave the article, and I stayed up all night to read the back and forth transcript of the meeting, and I was surprised. That's a euphemism.
You were hurt.
I was hurt because of what happened in terms of how they talked about it. It has to do with, several things. At first, the natural way I felt was the way most people who first got outraged were, what, they're banning teaching the Holocaust now? What's their problem? But it wasn't exactly that. And I had to get over that notion while I was reading it. It was actually something else. So it turns out, because of a case that existed in the 80s in somewhere in Long Island, of a book being banned from libraries, and a student took it all the way up to the Supreme Court, where a split decision awarded him the right to have what he wanted to read, but they didn't make a definitive set of case laws. What they did was they said, well, when banning a book, if it's because it's not age appropriate to a child and not letting it be available in a library easily, that was perfectly okay. So they in the guise of protecting children, they focused on things that really did hurt me, which was in that Prisoner on the Hell Planet strip especially. They started saying there's a nude woman, there was nudity, a nude woman, and there was cursing, and therefore, open and shut case, those are the things that you could ban a book for: inappropriate language for children and sex. The thing that offended me so much was the nude woman who was on one of those slides wandering by, was me trying to understand what my mother had done. She had killed herself in a bathtub, taking an overdose of pills and also slashing her wrist. So she was sitting in a bloody bathtub. And when all of those memories that we had talked about a few minutes ago came flooding back, it was that memory of her body in the bathtub being found right before I came home. My father found it, although I was supposed to if I'd been on time. And I drew it rather chastely, but there is a black dot of a nipple seen from the back of the woman in the bathtub. But to describe her as a nude woman rather than a naked corpse seemed genuinely hurtful and offensive, and so beside the point, but it was where they focused all their energy. Every once in a while, they'd blurt out something about how horrible it was to see hanged people and children being killed.
Well, they said that, yes, the book shows, Nazi killing babies, which actually love you to talk about what you showed and what you didn't show of that part of your father's story, and that simply having it in the book promotes, that was the
hanging
word.
People.
Promotes this violence. So can you talk about showing what you showed of, and what you purposely, because it's another reason why you were interested in doing this as a comic strip in your medium, which was far from obvious at the time where you took this on, was the controls that you would have over what is shown and what is not shown, and the abstraction of it in a comic.
Okay, well, even though I'd found those horror comics in that garbage can, I didn't want to make some kind of grand guignol of seeing how bloody I could make it and how overwhelmingly scary I could make people over what happened, but I had to show it. There was no shying away from transmitting my father's story as best I could by visualizing it. But for instance, when he describes how he was in a bunker, a hiding place, and while he was in that hiding place, they had rounded up a bunch of people to take them on trains away from the ghetto, and then Nazis would pick up a toddler, an infant, and smash them against the wall by their legs, and that would be the way they handled it, and then throw them into the train. I didn't want to draw that especially, but it turns out my father said that I didn't see because I was in a bunker, but people told me the next day. Therefore, I was able to show the motion. If you have the book ever and see those pages, there's the motion of somebody swinging something. Could be and you see a leg, but it's like as if it was a bat or something, or a tennis racket. You don't see anything else, but you do see in the next panel blood, black blood dripping on a wall. So it's clear what happened, but I didn't have to make it as gory as possible to get the impact, and I think quite the contrary. Comics drawings, even when they're much more illustrative in style than mine, carry the information very viscerally. And I was able to restrain it by putting a speech balloon over the blood, with my father saying, I didn't see it directly, I heard about it the next morning. So it blotted out what would have been the gorier part of the picture, for example. And then with the hanged Jews in the ghetto, which they left hanging these corpses for a week to discourage dealing in the black market, which meant trying to get enough food to survive. I showed the hanging, and my mother's father coming back shaken, having seen it, because these were the people doing what the rest of the family did, was finding some hustle that could get enough food to keep living. But there, what I did was I had these mice, and they all have more or less the same head, as you know if you've looked into the book. It's a miracle to me even that I was able to transmit who was who with so little in terms of visual cues for these mouse masks, the relatively blank, inspired PS and in parenthesis by Little Orphan Annie's eyeballs. If you ever saw the comic strip version, it had just 2 discs for eyes, and I found it so much more evocative than the more expressive comics drawing in Mad even, just because you had to project onto that little bit of white paper in the oval what the expression was and who it was by very few signs. And it allowed them to be there, and below where they were hanging, in the row below, there's just the feet shown, and a little box giving a capsule version of who each of these people were. So they weren't anonymous mice. This one worked in this place, and my father knew this person for many years, and so on. So there was giving them personhood, even though it was just these relatively anonymous mice hanging. And it was a strategy throughout the book. There were certain things that just absolutely had to be shown. And I wasn't trying to shy away from it. I was just trying to figure out, how do I do it so the theater is in your head, not just on the paper where it is at, weirdly, a greater distance. And I found that the cat and mice metaphor made that very possible.
And there is a way in which it was more than important, it was essential for you to use caricature, to use the concision of comics and of the symbols to represent, obviously, the reason why most of your family was killed and your parents, what they went through, but that it was, as specific as you were trying to do, it was important for you to also talk about it as othering. Can you talk about the request that you got from the Holocaust Museum at some point to do a show in the 90s about what was, they wanted to do a show where you would like get to be Vladek or Anjan and you
Oh geez, that's after, yeah, well that was, they wanted to show, no, it wasn't, the reason that threw me is, it wasn't the Holocaust Museum, it was the Anne Frank Museum. That,
okay, sorry.
and
I thought it was the Holocaust
there
Museum.
were two different
Washington.
shows, which is why I'm
Okay.
getting confused.
Okay.
They were, I think they'd even had a mouse show at the Holocaust Museum, but the Anne Frank thing conjures up for me the phrase, there's no business like Shoah business, which was popular at YIVO, the Yiddish organization in New York City. That was a historical organization, because whatever was happening, Anne Frank had to remain part of the franchise, you know. And I'm not putting the book down in any way, but there was this thing of wanting to make sure you understood the connection that Anne Frank had to whatever the centrality of the Holocaust was and being revealed. So they wanted me to do a show that was paralleling when Anne Frank was here, Vladek and Anja were there, and then track the whole show month by month through the Holocaust to show what their disparate fates were and how it worked out. And I just had zero interest in doing that, because, you know, when I was doing Mouse, it really wasn't to teach the Holocaust to anybody, let alone to 8th graders. It was to find out what the hell happened. How did I get to be born when both my parents were supposed to be dead, you know? So I had no interest in doing that. And a few years later, when I was back in Amsterdam, I got to see when Schindler was here, Anne Frank was there. So and at some point they even put out, when Françoise said earlier that it was very far from anybody's mind to do a Holocaust comic book, you said, it was an anomaly. It had no reason, it was a peculiar thing to do. But by the time the Anne Frank Museum got re-involved, they did a much more well-drawn version of the Holocaust in a Tintin style, and they said, now in color, you know, because my book was only in black and white. So there was this strange relationship with them. I had a much more interesting experience since we started on that one with the Holocaust Museum, where they were talking to me about having a show, and really their mandate was to show the artifacts and evidence of what had happened in World War II. And they were going to do this thing, and I said, you know, this can be shown in other contexts. It doesn't belong here. But if you're going to have a show that's not strictly artifacts and art made during that period, why don't we do something about former Yugoslavia, you know, the Serbs and the Croats and what was going on there.
Srebrenica.
Yeah. And said, well, maybe, what would we do? We can't do it for a few years. I said, well, why not? Well, preservation. It doesn't have to be real art. It can be Xeroxes of things, but just to document what's happening there and why it's still another genocide going on. And they were game, and then one person at the table said, well, what would be in it? I said, I don't know, we can ask artists to make responses, we can show some photo documentation. And then one of the oldest members of the board was saying, what would you call it? I said, I don't know, how about never again and again and again? And he said, well, that's all right, as long as you don't call it the Holocaust. And but then they and I just didn't have an easy time finding a way through. But what it did catalyze, and I'm very kind of happy about that, is they got hold of a bunch of Life magazine photographs of what was that was documenting what was going on, and they did have a photojournalism show about it, and that's all I wanted, was that it be acknowledged, because in a way, Françoise and I puzzled over this for a while. Why is there a Holocaust museum in Washington, D.C., well before there was a Black Suffering History Museum? I don't even know, is there now an Indigenous American Museum in Washington? I'm not sure, I don't think so. Is there? Finally, okay, good. There wasn't back then. But it was an indication of something interesting, which included American assimilation of their Jewish minority, which meant it could happen again. That might happen again and again if we can get past the red zone. But in any case, I was glad for that thing happening, and sorry for, again, these insanely long answers, but Maus itself didn't start as being about Jews and Nazis and so on. It started out because I'd been invited into that comic book using anthropomorphic characters. And so, as you well know, there's one more mentor in my life who was really important, a filmmaker named Ken Jacobs, who made non-narrative film, makes non-narrative films. Very important to me, introduced me to art, because I was a slob snob who only liked looking at newsprint. But he dragged me to a museum, showed me some Picassos, and said, just think of them as just making large comics panels and look at how they're constructed. And then he lied. Oh, I won't say that. Never mind. Never mind. There's a bit of the story I should just suppress. But in any case, he taught me how to look at art. And he was very important in shaping me as a comics artist that could break away from the tradition of comics that was useful to me and find something new to make happen there. And one day when I was already kicked out of college, and I'd come back to Binghamton to figure out what I was doing next, where that college was, he was doing these amazing deconstructions of Hollywood movies, showing non-narrative and very strange independent films and analyzing them. And it was in the course of that where I come in to sit in on the class, and he's showing old 1930s animated cartoons. And a lot of them were very racist, like minstrel blacks with big white Al Jolson-like lips, playing jazz and talking with a heavy accent. And what happened was, he said, well, what's the difference between them and these cartoons? And then he showed early Mickey Mouse cartoons. Mickey was a jazz singer. He was basically Al Jolson with two big ears on top of his head, but with that minstrel face. And he was much more of a wise guy than the middle-class Mickey that one found on the TV that I was looking at the time when I was growing up, or now just a corporate logo. But ultimately, it opened me up. I was going, what am I going to do for funny animal comics? It just has to be anthropomorphic. And I thought of doing a horror comic story where there's an anthropomorphic mouse who goes out of his house, and as soon as he gets out, like he's caught in a mousetrap and killed. So there's a little horror comic guignol kind of approach to this stuff. And about 10 minutes later, I went, that's not worth the work. It's hard for me to draw comics. And then when I saw this strip, I went, Eureka! I'll do something about Mickey Mouse, about cats and mice, the Ku Klux Cats, you know, and how they treated mice in America. And that was good for about 24 hours. And then I went, oh man, I know very little about the black experience in America. This was well before everybody acknowledged that from my side of the tracks, we just didn't know that many black people intimately. And I just felt scared of doing it because underground comics were using a lot of the stereotypes that are part of the natural language in comics. Like when you got a book on how to draw comics, especially the older ones that I was looking at, they'd show you that the way to draw a Jew is with a hooked nose and whatever, and the way to draw black is with those white lips, and the way to draw an indigenous American was with feathers sticking out of his head and talking with the word ugh and me, and so on. So that was just the vocabulary of comics. And underground cartoonists, especially starting with Robert Crumb, were using that old language in a 1930s style, or 20s even. And we're using that racist imagery in ways that would be very horrific to any of you who haven't seen it, which is why Robert's work is canceled in the popular culture, but an important part of our bigger culture, finally. And basically it was to try to detox us from the stereotypes that live inside our heads, was the motive. But I felt if I did that in my cat and mouse comic strip, all I could do is be seen as blithely irreverent toward what the symbols implied. And it was at that moment that the Kafka stories came back. You know, like there's a story called Josephine the Singer, or the Mouse Folk, and it's about them being workers in a field, all the mice, and one of them singing her plaintive song of suffering. And it just made cats and mice, it works just as well with Jews. The reason that was worth unpacking is because what's going down now, with mouse being banned in McMinn County, Tennessee, and challenged in a lot of other places, has to do with, on the one hand, I was as faithful as I could be to my father's story and the conversations that would take place between him and me, including my contradictions to his story based on what I was reading, and so on. But as specific as it was, by retaining those cats and mice, it made it about all othering. You know, like although there's a very specific story with these masks on, it could have just as easily been about the Klan and Reconstruction era America.
I'll stop you there because I want to leave room for questions from
We're there,
people in the audience.
but we never got to talk about the rest of my life.
Well,
Shit, okay. Question time.
Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions. If you would like to ask a question, we're going to ask you to line up right here at the mic, and we'll take as many as we can. This is, again, questions, not comments. That's for your Facebook. Okay, so we'll take a question from the virtual viewers, which is, what do you think your father would think about the impact that your book and his story has had over so many years?
So from this you made a living? You know, it was interesting because he died before the book was finished. I'd only finished, I think, chapter 4 or 5. And I didn't think he was even, he cared much about it. Later on, I found out that he'd been bragging to his friends that I was doing this, but I didn't know that at the time. And I would show him the work as it was going along, and I was wondering what happens when I get to the parts that he would be uncomfortable with. He couldn't read comics himself that easily, so I would have to sit there reading with him, saying, see, in this panel you're saying this, and I'm saying this. But he never commented on the one where he'd asked me not to include a premarital affair he had had, and me promising not to include it, but there it is on the page. He never commented on that, but he did say, as I also included in the book, people will be interested in this. And stepmother, Mala, says, yes, they'll be interested. And he says, yes, even I am interested. And she says, yes, but it's your story. And I said, no, someday you'll be famous, like what's his name, which turns out to be Walt Disney, if you've read the book. I had to leave the panel in order to write that down so I could include it in the book, basically. So I think now he'd certainly be, I think, despite the ways in which I wasn't respectful, probably able to embrace it. He was able to embrace the strip about my mother's suicide that he saw included in the book, even though I didn't expect it of him. And I'd say also that he was more understanding than I expected him to be. It got to him when it was in an underground comic and had been shown to him through the stepmother, but the result of all that was he read it, was very upset, but when I saw him, he just said, it's good you got it out of your system, which I just didn't expect him to have that, which is why it's great to use real life and real people, because you can't make this shit up, you know? People are bigger than you ever expect them to be, and it's something to always bear in mind when making comics, writing, or just living your life.
Thank you so much. I'm curious as to your life and art pre-Mouse versus post-Mouse, and it seems like you were in this underground scene. Did you suddenly get catapulted above ground? Did that change your art, or how did this new notoriety affect you?
Well, before Mouse, it was my Topps Bubblegum life, working for men's magazines, first subversions of Playboy, then Playboy, and doing weird comics and underground comics, making them weirder and weirder. And that was all the best of that. The rest of it, I don't care if it ever gets reprinted or not, but I did a book called Breakdowns, which was the most sophisticated stuff that I was doing prior to Mouse. So it includes that 3-page mouse that I was describing. It includes Hell Planet, but it includes also a lot of strips that dealt with the formal aspect of comics language and how it could be used. Breakdowns was thanks to Woody Gelman wanting to publish anything I wanted to publish. It turned into this book, Breakdowns, that allowed that to happen when nobody wanted such a book. Still wouldn't, maybe many people, but it's coming out again in paperback in about the end of November with a long introduction and a postscript gathering that stuff together. And I think it was essential for me to do all those strips to be able to start Mouse. During the making of Mouse is when I did a lot of other kinds of work, including editing Raw magazine with Françoise. And Françoise was the bedrock that allowed Mouse to get made at all. She's the only editor whose advice I would accept, although only after stalking out angrily and coming back 48 hours to say that she was right. But so be it. So during that period, I made other comics that were in the spirit of what had been in Breakdowns. Taking breaks between chapters of Mouse to do book covers, lithographs, other projects that were exciting to me. After Mouse, I had a heavier load because Mouse hit way bigger than we expected. I always assumed that Françoise would print it on the small printing press we had in our loft, and it would be distributed through the underground comics market, such as it was in the dismal 80s, and it just didn't go that way. So after Mouse, I kept trying to find loopholes in the contract, but Mouse was so enormous as a project, 13 years in the making, that I found myself trying to stay out of its way. So the first thing I did after was a book called The Wild Party, illustrating a kind of racy, novel-length poem that kind of attracted me once I found it in a used bookstore, illustrating it in a style that was more decorative, that showed more of my, I don't brag about them, my drawing chops were more visible, let's say, in those illustrations than they were in Mao's. And it was kind of racy, so that was allowing something that couldn't come out.
We're moving to real life. I can interrupt you again.
Please.
There's a lot of questions.
There's a lot of questions. Well, as a result, the life after was running away from a 500-pound mouse.
There's like obviously a huge rise in anti-Semitism right now, and I know, especially in my high school, we've had a bunch of incidents. One student came to Halloween dressed as an East German soldier, and you've like dealt with this for a long time, and I'm only 17, so what advice do you have to like speak out and be an activist, but also educate people without maybe wanting to punch them?
Yeah, my first wisecrack answer was just going to be learn karate, but it's really complicated what we're living through now. It's horrible what we're actually living through now, and it's not just America. It just seems to be a fad, international, so that we have an Italian fascist sympathizer at the head of Italy, and the right is rising in many countries in South America and Europe, and autocracy is on the rise. And I don't know how to get around it exactly, except, like I said, I didn't think the McMinn County thing, as an example, was overt anti-Semitism. It was just ambient. You know, it just comes with going to megachurches, but it's not deeply ingrained. And it comes horribly with the nature of how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself only within a very narrow definition of tribe, or do you make it bigger? The opportunity to make it bigger exists now through helping. What's up? Is somebody talking to me? Or? No. Duh. So it's a hard question to answer with a specific, like, well, what you do is just get on this website and disseminate information and try to get people to vote to overcome the fixed roulette wheel of America's election process at a minimum. And in general, I'm in despair, so I can't be the best advisor. Like, I've just been floored by what's been going on. I never thought it would get this bad, this fast again, even though it was never healed. It was always just sort of like scars that we were carrying that kept being wounds that opened again and again. So if we can survive all this, maybe we'll get there. Like, there's enough smart people to go around. And it's a
Sorry,
cop-out to talk about a younger generation, but it's your
I have
job.
a much more optimistic answer, but
Oh,
that's
sure.
how.
No, go for it. That's why I'm still
I
alive.
just think that America and the world in general is going toward more diversity. I mean, it's a fact that you can't argue, and that will allow, like, for more points of view and more tolerance, and it's right now bringing like enormous reactionary powers that are vociferous because they're trying to hold on to this majority, but you know, numbers are on our side, so and young people, you know, have to pick up the pieces of where we're at, but I think despair is not warranted at this point because it goes, the liberalization of the world that you're growing up in is far more diverse and tolerant and interesting and less monolithic than the ones that we grew up in. So,
And it's why we're going through this horrible, spasmodic set of responses.
They are reactionaries, but we are the action, so you are the action. So.
Thank you.
I'm asking a question on behalf of my friends, indie comic producers and publishers from Russia. Mouse and many other important comic books were a huge success in my homeland.
I'm not quite understanding.
This is a question from a publisher in Russia?
Publishing houses, my friends and publishers.
Our friends' publishing house in Russia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Mouse was a huge success, and as you know, it was also banned in 2015. But after the war began, many people from the publishing industry started to think that maybe books have no power to shift public sentiment and prevent catastrophe. My question is, do you believe that books or other media can change the world?
Well, unfortunately, I think it is changing the world already. I mean, when we talk about other media, it's both an incredible possible building of a global village, and it's also capable of disseminating poison, and it's a matter of harnessing it. I'm partial to books, but I do tell, when I was teaching, I used to tell my students the future of comics is in the past, not meaning that they won't exist, but they exist through a different door than the blast that you get from screens from the moment you wake up till the time you go to sleep. But they're a much better way to be able to focus one's attention. And as a result, it can disseminate from there, which is why literature is so fundamental. Whether it's with words only, as the Gutenberg elegy had it, or with pictures, it's a way of being able to not just read, which is essential, but rereading is even more essential, to be able to dig down into something that's intrigued you and grabbed you. That's the way to really let it inhabit you, another mind inhabit yours, and expand your understanding. So it all exists within a global category, which is called media.
Yeah.
So if we can survive the conniption fits of a media that's at least as a medium or set of media that are as disruptive as movable type was, then there might be a future that includes rational thinking.
Thanks.
So what sort of advice would you give, say, an aspiring writer on like a craft or storytelling level? Because obviously you did an incredible job at that.
What would I suggest in terms of craft?
Like advice and
advice.
anything in general.
Seriously, write if you can't not. I mean, otherwise you're just chasing the phantasm of a successful book. I never thought Mouse was dressed for success, my mice. But I think if you write from what you can really genuinely feel and understand, you're working from a good start, and then find kindred voices, do it for no money and no expectation of money, and let gatekeepers see it and see if you found something that they want to grab onto. Do it with small presses, do it online, and do it when you have something to say. I mean, it's much easier to write when you've got something you want to say. Otherwise, it's just playing with blocks or something.
So we talked a little bit before about how Mouse was banned in the Tennessee school district. With this unprecedented wave of bans and challenges against other books, especially books by LGBT authors and people of color, and then Mouse most egregiously a couple of months ago, I was wondering if Mouse had ever been banned before, and what are the differences you see in how, if it was banned, what are the differences in how it was banned before versus how it was banned today?
Well, Mouse wasn't that banned, which is why it was kind of, there were people who were very distrustful of it, even when it first came out in America. But it was never really banned. It was challenged sometimes, and in terms of teaching it in school, I never thought it was made for children. I was kind of annoyed when I found out it was a young adult book, among other things, even though...
I mean, I first read it in 8th grade in my class.
Yeah, well, I mean, thankfully it's also being taught in post-grad courses, so I had to get over my animus and prejudice against young people.
To be absolutely truthful, it wasn't banned in Tennessee. It was removed. It was a request to remove it from the curriculum, which is somewhat different from being banned.
Yeah, literally it would be banned in terms of removing access to a book, but I was just the metonym for book banning. You know, how like the mighty long arm of the law is a metonym for the full body of the law, let's say. And yeah, you're right. It was really about LGBTQ plus, and about race issues. And in a way, I think Mouse was used as the example that outraged everybody outside of that small county because of what I was describing before, of it being sort of universal by being cats and mice and really specific in its information. It was easier to defend it than some nut going around saying, I don't want some man in a dress and a beard and stubble all over his legs and him being in the toilet with my daughter, as if this was like an issue. Everybody grows up in multi-gender bathrooms, you know, they're one at home. So it's not a problem. And the anxiety over some of those issues would not let people see past it to like make connections with other bannings, you know, like when I first heard that in Tennessee, for example, they were interested in not having anybody made uncomfortable in their classrooms, be like, I thought they were talking about black people, you know, but that wasn't it at all. It's not wanting to make Junior, whose great-grandfather was a Klansman, uncomfortable. And therefore, I have to admit that it's great to have these in the curriculum because I'd much rather have that kid learn the Turner Diaries with an educator than with their parent who had the book on their shelves, you know. So it's just... the bannings that did happen, Mouse was banned in a drive-by shooting in Russia, since that had just come up because it had a swastika on the cover and it made Putin uncomfortable. But it's only been, it isn't the main act. It's kind of insane that these great genius public relations promoters managed to make Mouse into a bestseller again. And it's, it makes them uncomfortable, not because of the Jews. It makes them uncomfortable because I'm cursing at my father in one point in the book. I'm cursing at my mother in another point of the book. It's about the intergenerational thing of not obeying authority. And people on school boards, they like authority. They like being in charge. And a lot of this has to do with squelching curiosity, with defiance of authority. Nothing in Mao's is more chaste compared to what they're seeing on their screens as soon as they get TikTok open. And it's not the issue. The issue is about defunding public education and libraries, God damn them.
One final question.
Thank you for this great talk. And after a lot of these serious questions, I have one question which is not really that serious. You talked about your initial influence of Kafka on you and how you discovered Kafka. If you were given a choice of taking any of Kafka's novels or books and reworking that into a graphic novel for the new generation or whatever,
which one would you choose and why?
Okay. First of all, I wouldn't. Because, I mean, I've never let Maus get turned into a film. I did let it get translated into other languages. I'm still resistant to having it online. I want it to be that book. But if I was going to somehow have to make a living and somebody said, okay, take a Kafka novel, we'll give you $1 billion, you know. I think it might be America, because he had never been here. He knew nothing about it, and he made it up. And that just seems so cool. When I read it as a kid, it was great. He discovered metaverses before anybody else.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks again to the Chicago Public Library Foundation and Bank of America and all of our sponsors. But most especially, please join me in thanking Art Spiegelman, Françoise Mouly. We have some signed book plates available.